Welcome to Fantastic Vision. Please subscribe us before you watch today's video. When news of the US-China reconciliation in Blunder broke, Dutch politicians probably didn't anticipate that the 50% penetration rule, once considered a trump card, would be suspended by the Americans without warning. Currently, the Netherlands faces a dilemma. On one hand, European automakers are pressuring for a swift restoration of supply chain stability. On the other hand, China demands restoration of full control to reach a settlement. The headquarters of Nexperia, seized by the Netherlands, now seems to have lost its original strategic significance. Most of its packaging capacity comes from Chinese factories, and Nexperia China has stated that its inventory is sufficient to last until the end of this year, or even the beginning of next year. A domestic substitution plan has been proposed. If the Netherlands refuses to return actual control to the Chinese company, it will inevitably face a greater backlash. How will this farce, which began under the guise of national security, ultimately end? In fact, the Netherlands' motives for seizing actual control of Nexperia were not entirely pure from the beginning. Dutch officials spoke eloquently, claiming the matter had absolutely nothing to do with the US, and was purely for intellectual property protection. However, the timeline is clear. The other side can't deny it, nor can they fabricate it. On September 29, Washington had just released a penetrative rule targeting Chinese semiconductor companies. On September 30, the Netherlands used its Goods Supply Act to freeze the assets of Nexperia, a subsidiary of Wingtech Technology, forcibly transferring 99% of its shares to a third-party escrow. On October 1, the Dutch court, with perfect coordination, swiftly stripped Zhong Shuezheng of his CEO position, completing the forced takeover of Nexperia's headquarters. As the 100% controlling shareholder, Wingtech Technology didn't even have a channel for appeal. The Netherlands only gave it 2 days to submit materials explaining the situation. Even if the Dutch side had objections, wasn't the negotiating table there? Instead, they chose the most confrontational approach of forced takeover, skipping all paths based on rules and dialogue, and directly overturning the table. While the Netherlands was still basking in its self-satisfied belief in protecting the interests of the Western camp, news from Blunder dealt them a heavy blow. The US and Chinese trade teams reached a consensus. The US would suspend its 50% penetration rule on export controls for 1 year, and China would correspondingly suspend related export control measures. Before the ink was even dry on this agreement, the legal basis upon which the Netherlands relied for its actions evaporated. Even more absurdly, the Americans didn't even bother to inform the Netherlands, simply leaving them out and sitting down to discuss business with China themselves. This feeling of being abandoned is probably like standing up for someone in a fight, only to have that person turn around and go drinking with their enemy, leaving you standing there bruised and battered, questioning your existence. Germany, which had previously supported the Netherlands, also began to back down and seek reconciliation, preparing to arrange another visit to China by Chancellor Scholz. The politicians in Berlin reacted quickly, knowing that continuing to stand up to the US in the context of US-China reconciliation would not end well. But what about the Netherlands? They were caught in a dilemma, unable to back down. The Financial Times analogy was brilliant. The meeting between the Chinese and US leaders was like a family meeting before the parents reconcile, with Europe as the trembling child watching its two parents argue overhead. Wingtech Technology's statement was unequivocal. any agreement to resume Nexperia's exports from China must include the condition of reinstating former CEO Zhong Shuizheng. This is not a business negotiation, but a declaration of principle. Restoring full control and ownership, behind these 8 words lies China's adherence to its own interests and principles, a reckoning with the Netherlands' illegal takeover, and a warning to the world. The brilliance of this condition lies in putting the ball back in the Netherlands court. If the Dutch government accepts, it's tantamount to admitting the entire takeover was illegal and demanding explanation, compensation, and an apology. If it refuses, European auto production lines will remain shut down, and automakers will bombard Dutch government offices with calls. Neither advancing nor retreating, this is the real dead end. Ironically, the Netherlands had previously been hoping that China would ultimately compromise under the consideration of maintaining the overall situation of Sino-European relations. I don't think China will make a big fuss with us over CIS, because the Chinese can't afford to lose face like that. This self-righteous judgment exposes their fundamental misunderstanding of China. China not only values face, but also firmly adheres to its bottom line. When its core interests are violated, it will not hesitate to stand up for itself and settle scores without hesitation. If the Nexperia incident was a precise surgical procedure, then rare earth controls are a Damocles sword hanging over Europe's head. The data in the European Commission's report is alarming. Europe relies on China for 98% of its rare earths, and key materials for electric vehicle batteries such as lithium, cobalt, and nickel are almost entirely sourced from supply chains controlled by China. When China legally imposes restrictions on the imposition of rare earth export controls, could plunge Europe's green industries into panic overnight. ASML's lithography machines in the Netherlands, and indeed the entire European automotive industry, rely heavily on rare earth raw materials from China. Now, Europe realizes it has no place at the negotiating table between the US and China. The Netherlands, which attempted to demonstrate its loyalty by acting on behalf of the US, has instead rendered the EU a complete outsider. Not only did it fail to gain US support, but even after negotiations, Europe has received no substantial assistance from either the US or China regarding its rare earth supply and supply chain development.